It is a delight to have you with us. We're, of course, joined by the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, a man who, during his considerable time of public service, made incalculably important contributions, not least by bringing Republicans back into control of the House of Representatives for the first time in decades. But happily for our country, he has remained very much engaged in his post-government life in public affairs. And he has been a key supporter of and advisor to President Trump, and is a fellow that we want to talk with about several of the pressing public policy issues of the day, specifically the election of 2020, what we have learned about the outcome with respect to the presidential race, and where we go from here. And we'll touch on that in our first segment. And he's been kind enough to give us a second, and we'll visit with him a little bit about China in that connection. Mr. Speaker, it's so good to have you. Welcome back to Secure Freedom Radio.
I'm glad to be back with you, and I really respect all the work you do and that your organization does.
Thank you. Let me ask you, sir, we have been now fed a steady diet from really immediately after Election Day. It has intensified. It has built into an all-encompassing narrative, it seems now, that there was absolutely no evidence of fraud, certainly fraud of a material enough kind that would have affected the outcome of this election. And yet it seems there is abundant evidence of just that. What do you make of what the truth is in this regard, and why we're being disinformed so comprehensively?
Well, I mean, I think the the level of disinformation, frankly, goes all the way back to the decision in 2016 by the elites that they just couldn't cope with Donald Trump being president. So I don't think any of that's new. I think the same methodical dishonesty, which has dogged this presidency for 4 years, is also dogging the recount question. They have a very clear model. If it helps defeat Trump, it's good. If it helps Trump survive, it's bad. We don't cover anything that will help him survive. And if you think of the internet companies as simply another part of the news media, they share the same unending bias, the same willingness to cheat. I did a little paper at Gingrich 360 on why I can't give up. And part of my argument was that you've had such an extraordinary effort to steal the presidency, whether it's Zuckerberg paying city governments $400 million, something which I can't imagine is legal, or it is the effort by the internet companies to literally block conservatives from reaching the American people. I mean, just go down a whole list of these things. When the internet companies block the oldest newspaper in America and the fourth biggest, the New York Post, which was founded by Alexander Hamilton, and the New York Times says nothing, the Washington Post says nothing, because the fix is in. It just tells you how sick it is and how bad it is. And my great fear is, if they can get away with this, who knows what part two is. And I think the fact that Hillary Clinton could delete 33,000 of her emails and have one of her staff use a hammer to physically break up the hard drive. And there was no suggestion that that was obstruction of justice. For me, it was the beginning of how deep the sickness has gotten. And it's just gotten sicker since then, because it's gotten to be a world in which anything you do to hurt Donald Trump is by definition morally appropriate.
Let's back up for a second to something you touched on there with respect to the New York Post. I think listeners to this program will recognize what you're referring to there, but what we've learned since the election, notably through work of the Media Research Center, Brent Bozell's shop, is that the suppression of information about Hunter Biden's laptop with all the evidence that it has of the compromise of not just Hunter Biden, but other members of the Biden family, including the big guy, Joe Biden himself, by the Chinese Communist Party, actually had an impact on this election. I believe that their research at the MRC indicates something like 10% of Democrats who voted for Biden, not being aware of this, well, very serious concern, and we'll talk more about it in a moment, but would not have voted for him had they known. That would have been more than enough, even with the fraud, I think, to have turned the tables. That is an extraordinary development. I think you're absolutely right to call it out, Mr. Speaker. What does it portend? You talk about part two. What does it mean if this is now essentially accepted behavior on the part of the media, as well as the political elites?
Look, I think that's why it's a worthwhile fight right now to try to see how much fraud we can prove, because I think it helps educate the country far more. About 30% of the country thought there was fraud on election day. By the end of November, it was about 36%, and last week it was 46%. Actually, a plurality, 45% did not think there was fraud. So I think the more we lay out the facts and the more we get people to see it, you begin to shape public opinion. I also think that as the country more thoroughly understands how dangerous communist China is, that rebounds to begin to limit the freedom of self-destruction in a Biden administration. You see the remarkable mess in the House now, where it turns out that Congressman Swarwell had a relationship with a Chinese communist professional spy. The FBI told him, and apparently Nancy Pelosi, about it, and she appointed him to the Intelligence Committee after she knew that he had a relationship with a Chinese communist spy. And that's now, I think, going to become very expensive for the Democrats to sustain. So I think that we are in, I think, one of the most corrupt periods in American history. I think that it combines some elements of the robber barons with people like Zuckerberg, some elements of classical corruption in the sense of shame of the cities and the whole reform of the big city machines that was the hallmark of the progressive era, and some elements of a national, and to some extent through Davos, an international effort to redefine power and to strip power away from the middle class and away from everyday Americans and centralize it in left-wing cuckoos and their instruments in what is, I think, pretty bizarre. I candidly, although I'm a historian by trade, I don't think I fully understand how sick the system has gotten.
Well, you're talking about several things here that all require further attention. The Great Reset, I guess, is what they're calling this makeover, and it's actually, as I understand it, really not just aimed at stripping power from regular folks like American voters. It's essentially stripping sovereignty as well in favor of sort of a globalist agenda. And corruption, you're so right, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely at the core of this. Let me just ask you, and I want to talk about China in greater detail here in our second block, but just going to what you described there, you, of course, as Speaker of the House, had the prerogative to appoint members to the House Intelligence Committee. It is a select committee. You and your minority counterpart at the time had that right. Nancy Pelosi seems, Swalwell is a manifestation of this, but more generally, you look at Adam Schiff, you look at Andre Carson. These are people who are wholly political operatives. They are not national security minded experts in the House, it would seem as though their appointments have marked a kind of corruption, a politicization for sure, of that very important oversight body. How do you see what's been happening under Pelosi? We'll drill down on the Swalwell thing in a minute, but just at the macro level, what does that mean for oversight and the functions of the Congress in dealing with the intelligence community?
It's extraordinarily dangerous. We went through a much milder version of this under Jimmy Carter. And part of what people need to realize is that a great deal of intelligence requires your agencies to collaborate with foreign governments. Now, if foreign governments believe that if they share secrets with you and you have to tell Congress and Congress then leaks it to the press, they just won't share secrets. And I was part of when Reagan took over in '81. I was very fortunate in that Bill Casey, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, invited me out in a meeting with the head of French intelligence, where they were literally rebuilding the relationship because they believed that Casey could actually keep his mouth shut and that they could actually share secrets. And I think what's very important to understand that this process of corrupting intelligence, which also went on in the Obama administration. I mean, the head of the CIA under Obama was a person who I thought was intellectually totally dishonest and whose view of the Middle East was at best deranged. I mean, he kept looking for moderate members of Hezbollah, which is like looking for moderate Nazis or moderate KGB members. They don't exist. So I think that Pelosi's attitude, and I don't know why, it may be that we did for a brief period become a hegemonic power and therefore we could afford to be totally stupid at relatively low risk. But as the Chinese have grown stronger and as weapons that are really dangerous have grown more widespread, North Korea, Iran, presently Venezuela, I think you've got to go back to really taking seriously the challenge of national security. I was very proud of what Trump did to try to move the system against enormous resistance. And my fear is that we're now going to slide back. But in the case of Swalwell, I'm sorry, Swalwell, to have an ongoing relationship with somebody who turns out to be a Chinese communist spy, and then to be put on the Intelligence Committee is so beyond any rational behavior that I think probably there'll presently be a move to strip him unless he voluntarily resigns.
We're going to have to break for just a moment, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be right back with more on the Swalwell affair and the larger story behind it, I think, as well as more generally what the Chinese Communist Party is doing that makes it the most formidable adversary we have ever confronted. We're speaking with the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, now a private citizen, the author, among many books, of Trump and the American Future and Trump versus China. We'll be right back with more right after this.